Long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, which in this case would have been Florida in the late 1980s, I was besieged by a Bible verse. I was in my late 20s and had not yet darkened a seminary door, although I was extremely active in my local Methodist church just outside of Gainesville. The siege lasted a few weeks, and the verse that kept showing up everywhere I turned was the first verse of Hebrews 11. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. Part of the reason that verse turned up everywhere was that it was the assigned verse in a book I didn't know existed at the time called the Revised Common Lectionary, the 3-year cycle of Bible readings that many denominations, including ours, encourage pastors to use in their Sunday sermons. I have the option, and I don't usually use it. If you're an Episcopalian priest, you have to use the lectionary. Anyway, part of the reason I heard that verse so often in my church in the morning, at a different church on Sunday night, and in sermons I heard on the radio, was that Hebrews 11:1 was part of the lectionary reading for that week. But I didn't know any of that, so the constant repetition struck me as a message from God that I needed to pay attention to the topic of faith. And I began praying for God to show me what I needed to know and why I was being repeatedly hit in the face with that verse. In my defense, it wasn't just in sermons where that verse kept showing up, and it wasn't just that one week. I went into a bookstore, and there on a poster in the religious section was Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. I saw it on a bumper sticker on a car. I went to my pastor at the time and I asked her, have you got any books on faith? I need to figure something. I don't know what I need to figure out, but I need to figure something out. She gave me a book by German theologian Paul Tillich, and I read it, although I didn't feel particularly enlightened. I went to every faith passage I could think of in the Bible, spending a lot of time with Paul. No light bulbs going off. But the thing that really sent me over the edge, after asking God for weeks to kindly give me a bit more information about the deficiency in my understanding of faith instead of just, neon signs flashing Hebrews 11:1, I saw that verse. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen, draped across a multi-story building. I'm sure that didn't change with the lectionary readings. When I saw it across the building, I literally pulled over and yelled at God, okay, I get it. I'm hearing it. I've had that verse memorized since childhood. I need to learn more about faith, but I need more information. I had to memorize that years ago. Stop it with the verse already and tell me what I'm missing. If God had been a physical being riding in my car, God would have had to get out and walk. I was done with seeing the verse without any further direction. I got back to the house, got out my Bible, and prayed again. What am I missing? And God said simply, James. And I argued back, what do you mean, James? James is about works, not about faith. I had read the book of James. By that time in my life, I had read the Bible cover to cover many times. But in my lifetime in Protestant churches, especially in my native Rhode Island, which had at least the largest percentage of Catholics in the country, I had unknowingly drunk a bit of Kool-Aid about the relationship between faith and works. Martin Luther, the Catholic priest who unleashed the Protestant Reformation in Europe in the 16th century, was finding his faith increasingly unbearable as he was being taught that any sin, however slight, would condemn him to hell if he didn't confess it and then do penance for it. We talked about that last month when the priest, hearing Luther's increasingly tortured confessions of obscure sins, finally told him to please go out and do something worth confessing. Quit just coming with all this little stuff. He was getting tired of it. And we talked about Luther's release from his personal bondage when he really sat down and read Romans 3, where Paul emphasizes that it is faith and not our works that save us. Romans 3:28, for we hold that a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. The relief to Luther in reading Romans 3 and learning that God would accept him by faith and not works unleashed the massive force that was Martin Luther onto the Catholic Church of his day, and it changed the face of Christianity across the globe from then on. One of the rallying cries of the Protestant Reformation that Luther set in motion was sola fides, faith alone. So when Luther read the book of James, who claims, as Kathy read earlier, faith without works is dead, Luther heard that as a threat. Martin Luther translated the entire Bible into German with a huge gift to the German language and all kinds of linguistic advantages to that. But that allowed everyone in his country to have access to its words. And he very much, when he was doing that translation, wanted to leave the book of James out. He called it a straw epistle, and he wanted it excluded from not just his Bible, but all Bibles. He also wanted to trash the book of Revelation, which is a bit more understandable, but he didn't get his wish on either count. But pretty much overnight, one of the litmus tests for whether you were Protestant or Catholic was whether you believed that salvation came through faith or through works. And that was framed often as Paul versus James. Over time, it spilled over into the understanding of the sacraments and basically turned into a bumper sticker binary reduction of two complex ideas into two rival and incompatible approaches to Christian salvation, faith or works. When I was born into a Baptist church in the 20th century, that dividing line was already over 4 centuries old and still going strong. And in a state where I was the only kid on the bus on Wednesday afternoons because all the rest of them were at catechism at their Catholic parishes, the faith versus works line was just in the air that I breathed as a Protestant in Rhode Island. And at the time, I was getting hit with faith as a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen in the 80s. We were still a decade away from putting that centuries-old distinction to rest. It wasn't until 1999 that the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification was signed by both the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity and the Lutheran World Federation, putting aside the theological sound bites and declaring that, oh, you know what, we actually agree. And that in their language, they now shared a common understanding of our justification by God's grace through faith in Jesus Christ. That document wasn't Catholics caving or converting to the Protestant understanding. It was a recognition that we had both meant the same thing with different words for the previous 500 years. It takes us a while as Christians. As of 2017, 75% of the world's 2.4 billion Christians, including the World Methodist Council, have formally affirmed the Joint Declaration. And the root of that agreement is actually in both Paul and James. Last month, we talked about the fact that Romans has more than 3 chapters. Paul has a robust defense of the law of Moses in there, despite chapter 3 about faith. For Paul, our works are critical. They are just done in response to God's saving grace, which comes from faith, as opposed to doing them as a way of earning God's favor. And of course, the only time Jesus actually paints a picture of the final judgment of human beings by God, it's the only one in the Gospels, at the end of Matthew 25, the division is made according to how people have behaved. Those who feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, visit those sick and in prison, those are the ones God welcomes into the heavenly realms, while those who don't do those things are cast out. Works matter. But back in the late 80s, there was not yet a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. And in all my biblical searching on the subject of faith, the one place I was trained almost subconsciously not to look was the book of James, especially not chapter 2 with the faith without works is dead line. But God said, James, and so I opened up my Bible to look again. One thing that Hebrews 11 and James 2 have in common is that they both rehearse the faith of some of Israel's heroes. Hebrews 11 is known as the faith chapter for that reason. The whole chapter is person after person after person. By faith they did this, by faith they did that. James includes fewer people, but both of the people James lifts up, Abraham and Rahab, are also in Hebrews 11. So there was a connection. As I got back into James, I didn't just jump to the faith without works is dead part, which is a point James makes at both the beginning and the end of his argument in the second half of the chapter. But for once, I slowed down and paid attention to the argument in between those two bookends, especially where James calls out the example of Abraham, as Hebrews 11 does. And all of a sudden, as James talked about Abraham's faith not only being voiced, but tested, James 2:22 jumped off the page, and this is the NIV translation, which I was reading at the time. Quote, "You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did." I read that verse probably a dozen times. His faith was made complete by what he did. Not only was there no contradiction between faith and works, there wasn't even any distinction. They were the same thing. To say that someone has faith is a nonsensical statement if that faith isn't evidenced in what they do. We're warned constantly in all kinds of settings, watch what they do, not what they say. Why? Because when we actually believe something, that will become manifest in some way in our actions. Might take a little bit of time, but if we believe it, we are going to act on it at some point. That's part of Hebrews 11:1. Faith is both evidence and substance. You don't have either evidence or substance if it's just a belief in someone's head. Our faith is made complete, alive, when there is substance and evidence to put on the bones of our belief. It is made complete by what we do. As an example, because I believe in climate change, when I bought a house on the Cape in 2015, I checked the elevation against the projections of sea level rise for the area before I bought it. I was not in a flood zone, but I bought flood insurance anyway, as I watched areas of the country much further inland get destroyed when 20 inches of rain fell in 48 hours, and watched 500 and 100-year floods start happening every 5 or 10 years. I believe that's the new normal, and I acted accordingly. And it's like that for every single person and has nothing to do with faith. We will eventually act on what we believe to be true, even when we're wrong. That's why conspiracy theories are so dangerous. If you've been following the woes of the town of Springfield, Ohio, this past week, they've been flooded with bomb threats. They had to close schools for 2 days. Yesterday, they were getting the bomb threats at hospitals, death threats. The mayor is begging the hate to stop. The 15,000 Haitian legal immigrants in the little town of 60,000 people are, as we speak, in fear for their lives because of a xenophobic smear campaign that began with some person's racist Facebook post and then spread to 60 million people on national TV last Tuesday night and has been amplified since. That bigoted, totally untrue smear campaign with zero evidence and strong denials from all levels of that town's government that Haitians in the town were eating people's pets, a lie made up out of whole cloth, is now being used to dehumanize people to make their deportation acceptable, even though they are there legally. Spreading even absurd, easily disproven lies will get some people to believe them. And once they believe them, they will act. That's how human nature works. Early in Matthew's gospel, as Jesus is teaching in what we now call the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus ticks through many of the actions in the Ten Commandments, but with a twist. There's a kind of formula in his words as he describes the commandments. You've heard it said, quotes the old commandment, but I say to you, and then he adds to it. In that formula, when Jesus says, for example, in Matthew 5:21, you've heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Jesus doesn't follow that saying with that killing is okay, or don't worry, I offer forgiveness. He says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. He does the same thing with the adultery commandment, moving backwards from the action to what's going on in the heart, and says you're in just as much trouble if you lust after someone as if you actually committed adultery. Well, why would that be? Because what is inside eventually comes out. We act on our belief. What we believe influences our emotional state in certain situations, and that leads to action. Not just in religious beliefs, but in what we believe about anything, from investing in the stock market to buying groceries to our choice of work, play, and relationships with others. If we believe some people are inferior to others and we are superior to all of them, that's going to come out, sometimes in ways we recognize and often in ways that we don't. At the beginning of Jesus speaking about all of that in Matthew 5, I hear him saying the point James is making. Jesus says in Matthew 5:17, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. In the language of James, Jesus has come to complete the faith represented in the law with his actions. It is completion, not replacement, because our faith is only made complete by what we do. Paul, even in Romans 3, makes the same point. As he says in Romans 3:31, do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. Paul is just working the same equation starting at the other end. They had a different set of problems in front of him. I think a lot of the misunderstanding could have been avoided if we translated the Greek word pistis as faithfulness instead of just faith. The word faithfulness implies acting in a way that's in concert with what we believe, which is, I think, the point. Faith and works are not separate things. They are the beginning and end of a process that occurs naturally in people and to some degree across all living species. If it believes you are a threat, the creature will do the same thing humans will do: fight, flee, or freeze. What it believes becomes evident in its actions, even if those beliefs are wrong. You know, when my father went to try to pet the paw of a cheetah that was sticking out from under a cage at a zoo, it didn't matter that my father had good intentions and just wanted to pat the paw of the cheetah. The cheetah's paw in an instant went and he escaped without a wound. But what mattered was that the cheetah believed he was a threat and acted on that belief. When we try to separate belief from actions in religious matters, we invariably get into trouble. If we leave belief in our heads by itself, we invariably end up turning people away from Christianity because we become hypocrites. We say we believe in Jesus, that Jesus is in fact God. And then we behave as if his teachings don't really matter or aren't relevant to us today, putting our real faith and trust elsewhere. It's obvious to anyone watching our actions what we believe and where we put our trust and our faith, and they judge us accordingly. On the other hand, if we insist that God is only interested in our behavior, then we get a different set of problems, since there are plenty of people who do outwardly good things for reasons that have no basis in Christian teaching. We might want to raise our status in society. We want to be seen as charitable on the outside, even though we're financially robbing the charity behind the scenes. We don't believe God really loves us, and we keep trying to help people in ways they don't really want and haven't asked for in an attempt to impress God or to feel worthy. I remember one of Garrison Keillor's monologues when he warned clergy not to tell people that they were forgiven. He said, all your church workers, they're doing that out of guilt. You tell them they're forgiven and you will lose all your volunteers overnight. and he was only half kidding. His faith was made complete by what he did. Faith and works, belief and action are a single process common to all living species to one degree or another. If we have one but not the other, our faith is dead. The process is incomplete. It's perhaps the single most important takeaway from this whole series I've been doing on heretics. One more week. What we believe is important because it will naturally and always at some point affect the way that we behave. Our faith will be made complete for good or for ill by what we do. And what we do will determine the kind of world we live in, whether God's kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven or whether it will be on earth as it is in hell. The choir this morning will be singing a mashup of two spirituals about the Day of Judgment. We often hear such words as either a prelude to an altar call to profess our belief we think will save us, or as a threat if we don't clean up our act on how we behave. Where will you be when the trumpet sounds? Sinner, please don't let this harvest pass. But for the enslaved Africans who first sang these songs, they were a call to specific and immediate action. They were a kind of code to explain physically where to go to find freedom, not in a life in the hereafter, but maybe later that night or early the next morning. The sweet chariot coming to carry them home might be a hay wagon, secured by Harriet Tubman, taking them to a free home in the north and coming by in a few hours. And they sang out the need to not let that harvest pass, lest you remain in your bondage. As the choir comes forward to sing, I invite you to hear the words as those who first sang them understood them. Those who enslaved them listened to the songs and were happy to think they expressed only a belief in a freedom in the afterlife, something oppressors still encourage among those they impress. Set your hopes on a heavenly crown and you're less likely to become desperate enough to act out about your earthly lot. And while it's atrocious to think that so many Christians, then and now, were content to let Jesus be the only one whose faith was fulfilled in action in this life, there were those who risked their lives to physically harvest captives in the night and carry them to freedom, making sure they're in a safe place and ready to rejoice when the trumpet sounds. Faith without works is dead because it is not complete. Our faith, just like the faith of Jesus, Abraham, Moses, Rahab, and every person who has allowed their own beliefs to become manifest in loving action, that faith is made complete by what we do, and that is living faith. Amen.